Hi, it's Warren Huart here. Hope you're doing marvellously well. And today I'm with the great Brian Lucey. How are you, mate?
Thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
I am good. Thank you.
Quick question. I didn't ask you, what do you call your mastering studio?
This is Magic Garden Mastering. Magic Garden V3.
Version 3?
Yeah. Very similar geometry, but
right.
A different room. Same gear, same geometry. Little different amp here for this space, but yeah.
Now, we're here in LA, in Atwater.
Yep.
You were in Columbus?
Version 2 was Columbus, Ohio.
Right.
First record I did in that room was Brothers in 2010.
Right.
Which was fun because I'd been there an hour and a half.
Right.
And I started busting out the Chad Blake mixes, and I told Dan Auerbach that story later. He was laughing. He was like, "You must have been crapping your pants." I was like, "Yeah, I didn't really know the room at that point."
Right.
I'd spent 6 hours. And before that, for 10 years, I was in Delaware, Ohio, which is a small town outside of Columbus.
Right.
20-minute drive into the city for all the good city fun. But I actually lived on 15 acres in the country with
beautiful.
Limestone walls that were handmade this big, 1850 farmhouse. And in that facility, the low end vented through the wood floor into a dirt cellar.
Oh, wonderful.
Which worked well. Not as well as this, where the low end is venting through the walls into the building, but we can get to that later.
Right. That's wonderful. I'm a big fan of the Midwest.
Yeah, I love the Midwest. I was back to Columbus.
Right.
It's a great place. Love it. Good people, good food, great music.
So you were a guitar player, you played in bands. How did you end up mastering?
Well, I started playing guitar when I was 11, sitting in bed playing Rolling Stone songs, and then I ended up listening to vinyl blues, Albert Collins, B.B. King, all the blues greats.
Right.
And I taught myself by ear to play guitar, like a lot of suburban white kids did at the time.
Right.
And then when I was 18, I went to college, and my friend and I went to New York City, where he was from, in the second summer, so I would have been 19 or 20. And I ended up meeting these guys in a open mic jam down on Bleecker, and we played in the bathroom. And a few days later, I've got my '67 Jaguar, and I'm walking down the sidewalk, and there they are playing at a place called the Red Lion on Bleecker Street, which is still there, apparently.
Yeah.
And they said, "Hey, come up and sit in with us." I ended up playing with them 6 nights a week. So I became the, hotshot, take a solo guy that ended up singing a couple songs.
Great.
And a summer of that was fun, but, Hot Italian Girlfriend and Motorcycle aside, I didn't want to do covers my whole life.
Sure.
And I love those guys, but I left, went back home, dropped out of school, ended up playing in some bands where people needed a guitarist. So it was like a Grateful Dead band and this and that. Music I didn't know. And that led me to somehow hearing Robert Fripp's League of Gentlemen record.
Oh, yeah.
And listening to Let the Power Fall, the early Frippertronics loops.
Sure.
And getting into King Crimson and Robert's stuff. And that led to taking a guitarcraft course, which would have been 1989.
I have a very similar path. I was talking to Billy Sheehan about this a couple of days ago. He's a huge progressive rock fan.
Right.
So he knows English progressive rock bands that only fans know.
Right.
And so it's weird. I had the same kind of thing. Started off as blues rock.
Right.
I wanted to be Hendrix, Carlos Santana. I went to see Albert Collins. I've seen Albert King. I saw those guys.
Yeah.
And BB when he was alive. And Johnny Winter.
Jeff Beck did a nice tour with Stevie Ray Vaughan that I saw that was really great. It's
phenomenal.
Good stuff. So then Guitarcraft on and off for 7 years.
Wonderful.
And during that time I started a band, and the band was called Nude. We didn't put out records that you would be able to get on the internet or whatnot. But we were really committed and great guys that loved each other and worked every week. And we made 5 records during 14 years. And during that time, I started to engineer my own stuff.
Right.
So I owned a little house. I bought a little crazy loan. I had, at first it was Otari MX5050 4-track, and then it was some ADATs, and then it ended up being Ampex MM1200 16-track. I had 2 16s running together.
Right.
I had consoles that started with a Ghost and went to a Neotech, and I had an MCI in there in the middle, and and I had a whole full-blown studio in my house back in the late 90s, before that was a thing that people did.
Sure.
And then mastering was this very late entry into the process. I basically couldn't afford anything, so I did it myself. Sure. It was easy for me to put it on a credit card or take a loan against my house. So mastering came late, and then around 2000, I started to realize that I was really taken by the challenge, and that even the people who were the most famous people at the time, which are still the guys like Ludwig or Jensen or these guys, they weren't doing what I wanted to hear. There was something that I wanted to hear that they didn't do, and I couldn't afford them anyway. So I might as well set out to do it.
Sure.
And that led me to finding eventually, after a decade of gear experimenting and being a gear slub before there was a website, it led to this very simple chain.
Sure.
And this very simple chain that I have does what I wanted to do.
Right.
And I use the same chain for every record now for, it's been over 10 years, I think, the same chain. Although I did add something recently. We can talk about that if you want. But something snuck in. But it's basically the same thing, and I have spares. And
sure.
This is my thing.
I think this is a great segue into tell us about your chain.
Tell us about your chain, right? Da-da-da. Well, the chain is very simple.
Right.
Probably should start with the monitoring, because that's the fair thing to do in a mastering room. It's the right thing to do. In this room, I've got these 3-ways. The tweeter here was what interested me. This is a titanium, I believe. It's a metal with a cloth surround. So it's actually a 2-component tweeter. And that's really cool, because the high end of metal is what's really nice about metal tweeters.
Right.
The crossover point being, in this case, a little under 2K.
Right.
I've always thought that any tweeter, even in $80,000 Wilsons, has a hard time with that lower mid-range, the lower range, the mid-range, the 2K, 3K, 5K, 7K.
Yeah.
So this is cloth in the bottom end and metal in the top.
Right.
And that's what led me to say, hey, maybe I should try these out. So it got me into this line, which is very interesting, because this guy is Joachim Gerhardt. He used to design for Audiophysic. Rick Rubin has a history there. There's a little bit in our world, but mostly these are hi-fi people.
Right.
So he's in the hi-fi world, and this is Canalis. This one is birch ply, but actually they're now made of bamboo, and they're handmade up in Berkeley with water-based finishes. And the new version of this is the Allegra. The new version would have also this metal here with a different crossover. So this is old generation, but he designs the whole thing. He actually designs these speakers also.
Wow.
And these are sold, to other people through Sayaz, I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Right.
So really what led me to it was the tweeter, but then I discovered this whole interesting, 4-person small handmade Berkeley company that was really good at the things I wanted, which was linearity that was technically right, but also very dynamic. You can see there's a lot of movement here. Yeah. Very dynamic drivers that really move a lot of air at low volume and give you a lot of information.
Sure.
Most mastering rooms are very large, and they require big drivers and a whole big sound stage, because you've got people who come in the room and all that. I've always done my thing with people never being here.
Right.
So this room is small. All of my rooms are very small for master rooms, but I like that because I'm only 7 feet away, or 7.5 feet.
Sure.
And I can get all the dynamics out of the speaker.
Right.
And that to me is way more important than a big room that is impressing the client and requires a lot of power in the low end. Because big drivers are sluggish. Right. And these little guys are super quick. And there's no sub in here, and I'm very flat down in the 20s. So this is a very cool little off-the-radar company, Canalis, and it's the Allegra.
That's wonderful.
And the amplifier is new to this room, Cary audio. And my old Cary amp was very similar design, but only had 4 KT88s. That amps up upstairs if we want to look at that. That's up with my playback system with the spiral groove turntable, which is what these guys really do. So this is potentially 6 per side, EL84 types. I'm running it 4 per side because I don't need the power or the heat. And the beauty of this amp is that my old amp had, 4 of these 88s, and you had an ultralinear or a triode option. And I always wanted it in between. This amp, I can switch every pair in between. So I'm running 2 tubes triode, 2 ultralinear. Perfect. Right. So I've got a little more power with 8 instead of 4, and I've got the in-between sound. Front-ended with some CBS Hytrons. That's like a 50s era.
I'm going to get asked, so we can...
Oh, yeah.
What do you feel the difference is between the linear and the triode ones?
Yeah. Okay, triode is basic hi-fi speak. Triode has the mid-range bloom. Linear would have the power in the bottom, a little harder on the top, a little more linear. Right. Triode mode is a little more of this.
Right.
Vocals and the sweetness of the mid-range.
Sure.
So, one or the other, in my old amp, it was frustrating. This is perfect because I've got a little of the bloom, but enough of the power to keep it, linear and appropriate.
Great.
And the beauty of this amp is that a tube amp is truly a pain in the ass because you have to keep up with them. You do.
Right.
I mean, I've got a bias meter running here that I can switch from side to side. I keep an eye on everything all the time. So you have to keep up with that. It's not plug and play. But, you know, compared to all the solid state amps that I tried, solid state amps, even the best ones, I won't name names because I don't want to say anything bad, but they're all really quite good at the high end. Right. But the image would be sort of like, it would start where we are.
Yeah.
And it would go back, you know, some of them infinitely.
Right.
And it would give you this presentation which lacked the body and the realness that a tube amp does. The trick with tubes is they tend to be too distorted.
Right.
So you have to find a way to make a tube amp clean enough.
Right.
So that this amp, obviously you can't hear it in the video, but if you're in the room, the image is almost, it's 3 or 4 feet wide.
Right.
It's right here. It doesn't go infinitely with the reverb tail and all of that stuff.
Sure.
It's really a very palpable, very real, you know, just a real sound.
Right.
And that's what I like. Plus, coming from being a guitar player, I know tubes. I've got 22 tubes in the Fairman. The tube jockeying thing is part of where I come from.
Right.
So that allows me to really fine tune the sound. These are a particular type of tube that's a Chinese-made high-end thing that's very finicky. These EL84s are, I think, running tons of amps in there, which sound particularly good with these. You know, there's this whole tube jockeying thing which allows you to fine tune it, but I love that.
Right. When you're talking about the depth of field and everything, and what is interesting, I've been to a couple of mastering rooms where I have not enjoyed listening to the music that I made.
Right.
Because it's so separated. Like, you hear like, oh, here's the 40 on the kick.
Right.
And it's this disconnected low.
Right.
And you get all that depth and everything, but at the same time, it's not glued together in the way
Right.
that we listen to music. So it sounds like you're trying to replicate the way that people hear music.
Yeah, I mean, my thing, I mean, this gets into sort of what's different from how I do it. Since I come to this as a musician, as an artist, as a guitar player, a singer, a songwriter, a pianist, I come to it from the standpoint purely of musicality.
Right.
Musicality is everything to me. So most people in mastering, a bit more to a lot more technical. They're thinking about things from a standpoint of balance and evenness and translation, and all those things are important. But to me, what's really important is musicality. So in the room, I want to feel and hear, obviously technically right to a point, but I want to have the musicality pop.
Right.
So I have my refs that I've had forever, and I have my refs that I've made now that are popular records and what have you. And there's a certain kind of a cohesion to when the sound pops, because music being flat and linear and appropriate is boring.
Yeah.
It's not going to emotionally grab anyone to be well done. Right. And so a lot of mastering rooms are set up with Class D amps, or they're set up with a lot of testing with a laptop and da-da-da-da. I don't do that. I've never done that. I build these rooms myself. I test them myself. There's some R38 in this ceiling, which when I moved it 2 feet, the whole room changed, and I was like, okay, that's it. So it's all ear tested for me.
Sure.
I do it just like as a guitar player. You change out the amp, you change out the tube.
Sure.
You listen. You're constantly listening for this thing that you want to hear that makes it work. Now, is it linear enough? Yeah, absolutely. You have to be, or you wouldn't be in the business. But there's a certain musicality in my work that is what I do. And so in the room, it has to have that as well. What I do in mastering really plays very much on a very deep sort of thought about, really, I mean, the word is manipulation, but that's usually a bad word. It's a positive manipulation.
Sure.
When you put on a record I've done, just by the feeling of the first 2 seconds, I'm giving you a better chance to like that music because of that. So I think those are objective things that are very subtle and very musical, and they have to do a lot with, you know, the harmonic content, etc. And to me, that starts with the monitoring. I don't listen in here to make things even, firstly.
Right.
Making them even is part of it, but part of what's interesting in a record is that it's not even. So how even does it have to be versus how not even can it be? Because even is boring. And if it's too uneven, song to song I'm saying, then it gets to be unprofessional. But if you can walk that line, then it makes a really rich palette of a record. And the same way in a song. The song from part to part, you know, as you mix and produce, you think the same way, I'm sure. How much of this is really tightly done and how much of it is loose? Where do we leave things in? I mean, the record that got me known in 2010 to the world outside of my normal client base, who was people that never sold probably more than 1,000 or 2,000 records, was the Black Keys Brothers. And when Brothers came in, it was Chad Blake mixes and Dan Auerbach, who I'd done work for before and respected. And the second song, or was it Tighten Up? I forget. Well, one of the songs, which one was it? Had this little funny moment in the drums, and it was pretty, it was on the line.
Right.
And I sent Dan Arbach a text. I said, hey, there's this thing in a minute 10. He's like, no, we leave that in there on purpose on this one. We do that all the time. That's what they do. Now, some people would say they go too far, and that's okay. But that discussion of where do we leave in the humanity, sure, where do we intentionally put in a little humanity, I think that's key. Because perfect is the computer, and no one wants that.
Paul McCartney once said that when they were choosing takes, they'd always find a take that had just that one mistake that just made it special.
There you go. There you go. Yeah. And so another story that may be interesting, I don't think they would mind me saying, was going back to Brothers when they sent that, Chad, who I was aware, I wasn't really an engineer nerd. I didn't know mastering guys. I knew a few producers, but not many. But I knew Chad's name, and I'd heard his work. And and so I was excited to hear his mixes. And so before they ever sent anything, I think this is a good educational point. He said to me, hey, I've sent this to other mastering engineers, and they've said to me sometimes it's a little slammed on a limiter, because his in-the-box method now is 4 limiters on the 2-bus, decapitator and SansAmp pretty much on every channel.
Sure.
He said, do you want me to send you something with the limiter back down? And I hadn't heard the record. I said, let me get this straight. You, Chad Blake, who I have listened to for a long time, and Dan, who I adore as a person, I've worked with him for 2 years as a producer, you're asking me, who's never heard your record, how to mix your record. No. I don't want the dB down version. I want the one that you two guys in the room love.
Right.
And that's an important point, because, well, I did listen to it. He said, well, I want to send it anyway. So I did listen to 4 songs for about 3 seconds each. And they sounded too limited. It was actually the opposite effect, because he had pushed it to a place where musicality came together.
Right. And
the songs came alive. And that's the Brothers record. Sure. But I had the choice to say. They gave me the choice.
Right.
To say, do you want this other record that's like a dB down on the 2-bus? And wouldn't have been the same record at all. Even that 1 dB, huge musical change. So, all the time people ask me, hey, this technical thought, what do you think about this? I say the same thing over and over. I said, the one that brings you and your team to life, no matter the technicals, in the room, in the car, check it, it's that one. It's the fearless approach.
Sure.
I don't give a damn about
I totally relate to
perfect.
That. Yeah. That makes perfect sense. I suppose, tell me where you start.
Well, we start here with Sequoia. I use a little bit of the linear phase plugin that comes in here, and occasionally I'll use the de-esser, but generally this is really just to send and receive. So we go from Sequoia to the D to A, which is the now quite old MITEC 8x192. Now the important thing to think about with my chain is that it is a chain. Any single piece of gear isn't really that important. But what's really important is the whole thing. So when you look at this room, the first thing I would ask you to do is to see it as one thing. Because to me, this is the instrument. It's one thing. I cannot go with a dead L2 and make a record. I cannot go with this head being dead. I might be able to go with the envelope because this is my new piece. So this is new in the last 6 months. But the rest of this stuff, it has to be there for it all to pop. And the output tubes on the Fairman, for example, if they're not Bugle Boys from 59 to 64, I don't sound like my work. I'm not happy in here. It's not doing what I need it to do quickly and easily. And it sounds like a different desk. So something as simple as just, I'm always driving these output tubes, so they're always on. So something as simple as those output tubes being not Amperex Bugle Boys in that range changes the thing. So really, the first thing is to look at this whole thing as a whole, because that's what it is to me. It's a singularity. Now, having said that, this guy is quite old. There are certainly D to A's that sound better, but if I stuck any of them in here, it would ruin the chain, because it would change how everything behaves with everything else, including the monitoring. So I come out of here, I go to here, it splits it into 2 paths. One goes through the desk, and one goes straight to the monitoring. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 analog pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. It goes down here to the Pacific Microsonics, gets converted, goes from there digitally to the L2, the lowly L2, which is permanently set at, where do I have it now? 1.4, never over 1.5. I've had it as low as 1.1.
Right.
If it's below 1, it doesn't do the weird, funky, cool thing that L2s do.
Right.
And if it's over 1.5, it just sounds like shit. So,
Right.
like, never go there. But there's a little mid-range pop that happens here. So,
Right.
so digitally, we're there, we're here, then we go here to the head. I run the head, barely on.
Right.
And that basically is taking this square wave, and rounding it off a bit with some harmonics.
Right.
That it's very subtle on and off, but again, it's part of that thing that I needed years ago that I felt like, oh, it's all recessed. Right. It sounds very digital. This helps to give it a little bit of life. And then from there, we're back to here. So we've got basically a D to A, 4 analog pieces, a converter, that clipping the converter, a little more clipping here, a little bit of rounding, and back in. Once that it's back in the computer, I don't touch it. If I need to run a revision, I run a whole new thing. Because part of, again, the harmonic beauty and life that I love from my chain, any plug-in tweaking will wreck it.
Right.
So that makes my process a little more time-consuming. Some people can sort of run a low-level pass and do different limiter levels, or they can run a generic pass that they can tweak, and that makes it more efficient. Unfortunately for me, or fortunately, it's the way it is, the sound of this thing is really dependent on how hard do I drive the converter and how, it's like a guitar amp. It's running pedals into a tube amp.
Right.
That's very much what's happening here. So there's a real fine line between, cool and too much distortion. There's a fine line between good low end that moves air and good low mids that hits people emotionally and too much. So I have to rerun everything. But to break it down into pieces, this is the new piece. It's the envelope. It's more of a mixing piece.
I don't know this.
What's that?
I don't know this.
Oh, this is great. You should have one.
Great.
It's discrete class A. It has a bit of a tone, but it's a discrete class A piece. This Elysia guy, Ruben, the designer, he designed the original transient designer for SPL.
Nice.
Which started the transient designer craze, right? Yeah. Everybody has one now. So
one.
Ruben left SPL years ago, 10, 12, whatever, 15, I forget, to do the Elysia Alpha. This was his dream, and it was simply an economic nightmare for SPL. They couldn't do it. And with very understandable logic behind it. So he started this company to build this piece.
Right.
And now he's got a bunch of stuff. This is something he's had for a few years. Really creative, fun stuff. So what he did here was he took the original transient designer idea, attack, sustain, per channel, and he broke it up into a little bit more of a nuance. So there's attack with a frequency point and sustain with a frequency point.
Wow. And
then you can also run at full range. Normally these run in a mixing context. Most people who buy one, they get a stock one. It's 15 dB plus or minus. I know these guys a long time. This is actually serial number 1, the original unit that went around the country when they first made it. So
wow. I
had them modify this so that it's quarter dB. It's not switch, but it's little detented pots. So it's quarter dB steps. So I've got maybe 4.5 dB instead of 15.
Right.
Not sure what the math is there. I never go outside of 2 dB.
Right.
So I can do little teeny bits of expansion in an analog world with this.
That's great.
And this is new because let's face it, people are over compressing.
Right.
And what I used to do to deal with it was frequency things where I would do cuts and boosts and try to bring the life out of it like you do. And this is just a much better way to do it. So a great mix, this goes off. But a mix that's been overdone, even a little bit, I can do a quarter dB, a half dB of analog expansion.
Great.
And this is at the front end of the chain, meaning we're here to here, number 1. So this didn't get in the way of 1, 2, 3, which is my tone, really.
Right.
1, 2, 3 in the converter. So I added this recently. Other than that, we're 10 years with the same thing. This thing sounds horrible stock.
Right.
It was very popular back in the day. I believe Neve had a hand in it. let's just be honest. It's 5534s, like 60 of them.
Right.
It's a ton of caps. It's horrible, but the functionality is great. So Rob Harvey here in LA, who's actually now 5 minutes from me, but when I was in Columbus, I met him somehow, and Rob does a lot of great work here for all sorts of people in town and out of town, of course. He went through it. We experimented. We played with different ICs. We took out 40 or 60, I forget which the number of the caps. We took out 40 caps, and then all 60 of the ICs, we ended up with a Burr Brown, I forget, it's been a long time, 624, I forget, like a $15 IC, 8-pin.
Right.
So we basically clean that up a lot. So what you end up with is really the one and only sort of non-Class A piece in the chain. The converter Class A, these are all Class A. This is, it's a solid state piece. So you have that slightly forward solid state quality.
Right.
But this, being tube, has the slightly back tube quality.
Sure.
Between the two, you end up back where you were with the harmonic content of both.
Right.
So that's respectful to the source, but giving me the mojo that I want to hear.
Sure.
So these two work really well together. The second one is now this. So there's 1, 2. Then we go to the Alpha Compressor, Class A discrete, has a tone. The original one was even more zippy, and I talked to them about it, and they ended up sending a power supply, like the DC line, from the supply to the boards. They put some resistors in it, and they actually slowed down the DC coming over from the supply. And that's what this one is. I think they went to selling them all that way after that, but that may have been the initial resistance that they got when they first took it out, because they took it around different places. I mean, some people thought the lettering was too small, and they had to use their glasses, and that bothered them. I don't bother with that. But to me, it was a little zippy. It was a little speedy. And once they slowed down the DC coming over to the boards, I think it's brilliant. So I use that for, maybe, and I had it modified again. So my lights are 1/4 dB compression. So maybe a dB or so if I need it. Sometimes a little more, but rarely. Mostly I use it for super subtle mid-side tweaks. I do very subtle shaping of the V.
Right.
So subtle that you wouldn't notice and be offended.
Right.
Because I don't want to screw up what you did.
Right.
But monitoring in 90-some%, even really good mixers a lot of times, the monitoring might be a little narrow. It might be a little far apart. So you end up with not quite the right balance of, center channel power versus the side stuff. So this is a very important part of my work, is that the shape of the V is this sort of immediate style indicator, again, going with subconsciously to people.
Right.
Like if you listen to Destiny's Child, that stuff is like this. Everything on the sides is very high end. If you listen to something in the middle, Audio Slave or AC/DC or something like that, it's more of like this sort of classic rock where you've got some low end on the sides. And then you go into alternative music, like on Arcade Fire or something like that. You've got all this low end in the guitars, which makes for a meaty guitar, but takes away the punch from the center.
Sure.
So that shaping of the V is something that you all do in mixing. And then I respectfully tweak that based on the style. And even if you did it really, really well, you might have, you could have like a monitor constraint because, you've got 3 sets of monitors and your room is so wide. And so maybe they're a little more narrow. So because they're a little more narrow, you end up panning a little wider. And now the center power is a little bit lacking. Right. So from a subtle to a fairly extreme makeup I can do on that mid-side thing, which is if it goes too far, people wouldn't be happy. But I do it in a way that you don't notice. Right. And it clarifies that relationship because, I think going back to the objectivity of what people like, people need the power down the middle. They need the punch. They need the kick. They need the bass. They need the vocal, etc. And then, depending on the style, that dictates what they're expecting from the sides.
Right.
And so it's a very subtle sport. I don't step on people's stuff, but I do a lot of tweaking with that. Then we go on to the Fairman, which is really...
I've never actually used one of these. It looks beautiful.
It's a monster. It's a beautiful thing. 22 tubes.
Wow.
11 per side. All switchable. Switched here. Lundall transformers in and out, which is not my favorite, but in this case it works. It's a clean transformer. It wouldn't be my first choice for a microphone or for a preamp or for anything else. Right. But in this case, it does a nice job, quite neutral. And I do very subtle work, obviously, with all of these things. None of this stuff gets cranked. But the main thing with this is, like I was saying before, the output is always being driven, and those bugle boys are always on. And then things are switched on and off to taste. Right. But the output tubes are always on. And each of the bands here, low cut, high cut, I never use. So those are always off. But in terms of low shelf, low mid bell, high shelf, those four go on and off, mostly on a lot. And so in each of these sections, I have removed the tubes that came with it and put in tubes that really suit the band. So right now I'm thinking, let's see, high mid is Mullards, right, because of the nice, not too bright or harsh high mid-range boost quality of a Mullard. Right. High shelf is Telefunkens because of the nice clean ability to make a high shelf. The low mid is, I think, RCA Blackplate. Again, a similar thing. It suits the tube. Right. I'm using what's good about this brand of tube for this band of boost. Sure. And this is always boost. I never cut it. If I'm going to cut, I do it there, I do it here. Because the boost is where the juice is here. Sure. And then the low end is I want to keep the low end boost, the low shelf, quite clean. So that is, I believe, Sylvania. Yeah. So we've got American, Sylvania, and RCA Blackplate. We've got Mullard and Telefunken. And then the output being the Amprex Bugle Boy. And, the sound change with those tubes, did it make or break it? No. But it is a little more of that, game of inches and centimeters towards the thing that I wanted to do. I think of it very much as like, I work for music. I work for you, and we all work for music. So we cooperate towards serving. Wonderful. Yeah. There's the moment of inspiration. Then I think of it as 6 steps. The moment of inspiration, the arrangement, the performance. Those are the artist steps. Right. Then at performance, we have a tracking engineer. Yeah. Might be the same guy as the mixing engineer. Might be a different guy or girl. And the mastering. We've got these 6 steps. Right. So I'm really looking to take this moment and connect them in a way that's really strong. And to me, the best records are where from inspiration to arrangement to tracking to mixing, tracking engineer, mixing engineer, mastering engineer, there's what I call positive compromise. At each of these steps, the ball is rolled forward, and then you get to the end, and you're like, "Oh, holy shit, this is cooler than we thought we could do." That's what I'm hoping. I want to finish on that because I think that's a great note. Yeah, that's what I'm hoping for with every project, because you give up something. When music goes from silence to sound, or when the 30-minute mess becomes the 4-minute song. Sure. You give up something, but you get something. And when it goes from being live to being recorded, you give up something, but you get something. Sure. And the rough mix becomes the mix, and the mix becomes the master. So if each of those is that positive compromise, no matter the style, that to me that's a good day. And that's what I'm hoping that people do. I totally understand. It's a bit like when I say to an artist, they've got 5 verses, and they want to hear the first 3 verses before a chorus, and they're like, but you won't understand what I'm saying in the chorus unless you hear that 3 minutes of verses. And I say to them, but nobody will get to the chorus because you've got 3 minutes of verses. So it's like, right. There's always that compromise. It's like, I understand those lyrics need to be there to understood. Right. But nobody's actually ever going to get to the chorus. So. Positive compromise. Yeah. We've got to figure out what to give up to get something more. Yeah. And I think those 6 steps. Positive compromise. We're gonna. Yeah, let's go with that. That's a wise man's phrase. Thank you ever so much. All right, thank you. I really appreciate it. We could do this all day. Thanks for coming over. Thank you. All right, as usual, please subscribe. Go to producelikeapro.com and sign up for the email list. And thanks for watching.